I'm Crystal Davis, maiden name Yarrington. My mom was Beverly Griffin, and her father was Wilbur Griffin. He was the youngest son. He had 3 older sisters, and my great-grandpa Griffin, John, owned a Model A, and it was a 1929 Model A Ford. And this Model A Ford was bought new in 1929 in Kansas City by Clarence Crouch, who was his son-in-law, John's son-in-law, the owner's great uncle, and a few years later he sold it to his father-in-law, John Griffin of Miltonvale, Kansas, who was my mom's grandfather. And then it was passed down to my mother. It was passed down to his son Wilbur, and Wilbur passed it to my mother, Beverly, and Beverly passed away, and she passed it down to myself and my brother. So we share it. We ship it back and forth between Arkansas and California, and I had it first because I drove it the most, being the oldest. And then my brother had it we change about somewhere around 7 to 9 years. And then he had it, and now I just got it back in 2016. So I'll have it for a few more years. And so this is a picture of the Model A with a bunch of milk trucks that my grandfather owned. He had a business where he went around and picked up milk, and then he would take it in to have it pasteurized. And so this is actually before it was restored. It was gray back then, and now it's black and yellow. So my mom and dad had it restored and had it painted black and yellow. So it's fun to have. It's fun to drive around in the streets of California, take to a few car shows, and I'm going to send you some other pictures of it.
Yeah,
so
great.
Anyway, I feel very special that we have it.
So it's been in the family for?
Since 1929.
So about 90 years.
Yeah.
Been in the family for 90 years.
Yeah.
And then you guys have used it for some of the family events.
Yes, when my kids were young, we took like Christmas pictures with it in front of, with a big Santa Claus. And no, we're not big believers in Santa Claus, but we had a big picture of Santa Claus, and I sent that out for Christmas one year. And then, we've taken it for different kids' functions, proms, and weddings and things like that. And they take a little drive around it. My niece took it to her wedding in Arkansas, and so it was fun. It's very fun.
Each of the people who had them, meaning family heirlooms and photos, did their level best to bring what they could. We had them on display at the Miltonvale Community Center, and it was just fabulous to see the things that people had. I've got a couple of examples for them here. So this is the one of the items that was sent to me by my second cousin, Mike Rogers. This was Grandpa Griffin's harmonica, and it's interesting to see how much playing has happened on this harmonica. He was a very good harmonica player. All of his grandchildren remember him fondly for loving music. If there was music playing, he would act like he was the leader of the marching band. He had in his house an old Thomas Edison, they call it a phonograph, if you will, but the records were that thick. It's a hand crank on the side of it, so they would listen to those kinds of records. He was a carpenter. He had a carpenter shop just across from his house there in Miltonvale. It's interesting, Mike Rogers' mother, Clarine, gave me stories about what it was like when all of the grandchildren would come and spend some time with their grandparents. And it's a 2-story house in Miltonvale. It's interesting because she said there were times where she and the other girls would go up into the closet, open a large chest, and get out of it a bunch of old lady clothes. And they would don the clothing, and then they would march over to, across the lawn to Grandpa Griffin's carpentry shop, where he's in there working, doing carpentry work. And so, because of the planing, the wood chips that would fall to the floor were curled chips. So they would pick up those chips and they would put them in their hair so they had curly hair, and they would prance around the place and go and wave at the neighbors going by because they had curls in their hair. So those are the kinds of interesting stories of what our ancestors did to entertain themselves. My Aunt Claudia said that she is confident that they got on his nerves in his carpentry shop, but he never yelled at them. He was such a kind-hearted, loving man. A few other examples here. My grandparents. So my grandfather was Claude Logan, and this is his pocket watch. And so we inherited this. He worked for the Union Pacific Railroad in Cheyenne, and he was a carpenter for them. As the story goes, during the Depression years of the 30s, there were several temporary layoffs that he experienced, and that caused an understandable economic difficulties for the family. So my grandmother, Wilma, did a number of things to help augment the income. She took in boarders, would sublet out rooms, did a number of things to help that situation not be so difficult. And she gave her children, nonetheless, she saved enough money for them to have piano lessons and to enjoy music. A few of the other ones that I have as an example here, this is a very old Bible that was given as a gift to my grandmother Wilma from her grandparents, Grandma and Grandma Seward, and it was March 19th of 1908. So we try to keep this, obviously it's falling apart, it's so old, but we try to preserve it as best we can. It's kind of a little memento. And we have a song sheet here from my great-grandmother Griffin. Her sister Maud married a Wesleyan minister who traveled, and this was examples of the song sheets that they used back in the day. So there were other pictures and heirlooms that people brought with them, and it was just great for people to be able to see those things and put their hands on them and feel like they had some kind of tangible connection to the past. I had an opportunity, well, all three of us, my brother and my sister and I, we did have an opportunity. Our mothers took us out 2 visits to Miltonvale. I think one was somewhere around 1961, because my sister, I think, was just shy of 1 year old at the time. And then Grandpa Griffin was still alive at the time, and we have pictures of us sitting in his lap, in his rocking chair. But that's the only memory that I personally have of him. The rest of it comes from the stories that people have told about him. Everybody loved him. Yes, he was my mother loved him dearly, thought he was a wonderful man. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So my grandmother and grandfather, I never met my grandpa Logan. He died in 1942 of colon cancer. The family was living in Cheyenne, Wyoming at the time. My mother was 9 years old when he died. So she has fond childhood memories of things that were done where her father was with her, but unfortunately she has no father for the rest of her life. So they lived in Cheyenne for a number of years. The second daughter was Ravesta. Ravesta married a man named Vern Palmer and had a son named John Max. Well, during my mother's frequent childhood visits to Miltonvale, John Max and her, they were first cousins. They became good friends, and they grew up together. I think in many ways, John Max, who didn't have any other siblings, my mother was the sister that he never had. course, he had other first cousins that were around him too, but they were all girls. But I think my mother was particularly close to him. And John Max and his married a girl named Joan Capehart. They had 2 boys named Vernon and Kevin. That whole family is still living in Kansas, either in Miltonvale or in Concordia, nearby Concordia. The other children, you had Maud. Her family eventually moved to places like San Francisco, Portland, Vancouver. So they raised their families up on the West Coast. The 4th child, Wilbur Griffin, did raise his family in Kansas. He had a store and a gas station in Hollis, served the farmers, providing petroleum to their farming equipment. He would haul it out to them in his truck. He eventually moved to Agenda and owned a gas service in Talmo, Kansas. So that branch of the family stayed in Kansas. Their daughter Beverly attended the Miltonvale Academy and met her husband there, who was getting his degree at the Bible College, the Wesleyan Bible College University. So yeah, they raised their family, and they've lived in California and Minnesota and other places as well. Each of them have their own memories of their families, and they were able to come to the reunion, and we're glad that they did. I'll tell you something that I do find very special for me. About 1.5 years ago, when I was really starting to work on this thing and thinking it would be great to do a family reunion, but it would take a lot of work, I tried to reach people who were descendants of Maud, we call her Aunt Maud, and Uncle Clarence, Clarence Crouch. And we just kept striking out all over the place. Joanne gave me the phone number that she had for Clarine Rogers, one of their daughters. But every time I called the number, it was a disconnect signal. All I could recall is that Joanne Palmer said their son, Mike, was an opera singer. And so I Googled him, Mike Rogers Opera, and I found him on the internet. He had his resume there with his contact information. So I reached out to him, he responded, "Oh yes, Mom has moved from there. The reason why the phone doesn't work is because everything's closed up. She's now living with her daughter Karen in Sonora, California. She was 91 years old at the time, still kicking, but needing some assistance, and that's why she moved in." So I remember visiting with Wes and Clarine a few times growing up. And so I started placing phone calls to her. And she was very much aware that the family reunion was taking place and it was being worked on. And she was giving me stories. The one I gave earlier about the girls that would put the curls in the hair and whatnot, she provided that story. Another funny story was that my Aunt Kay and her, when they were, you call it their adolescent years, and they were being goof-off girls at the Concordia Park. There were barbecue pits that weren't really pits as much as back in the day. They were brick constructed barbecue places in the park. Well, they decided to grab a cherry bomb and when people weren't necessarily looking, drop it down the smokestack of that thing and then hightail it out of there. And when the kaboom happened, it's like, what? So they were troublemaking little girls at the time. Anyway, Clarine Rogers was a great lady. She spent time with your grandmother, my mother, and came down to visit her when she was, as you know, battling her own cancer difficulties in San Juan Capistrano when she lived down there at that time. And she went to church, and they had a great time together. Clarine described it as we sang more songs that the kinds of songs that she remembered, not the rock and roll type of songs that you'll see sometimes today. But anyway, both of them really enjoyed it, and because my mom, your grandmother, had converted to evangelical Christianity late in her life, it was that much more special that the two of them were participating together and sharing their faith that way. Well, it's interesting. Clarine's health was continuing to unravel over the last year, and she was praying for me and praying for all of us. I was praying for her, and she was giving me all kinds of stories, and would comment, I just don't know why God is keeping me around. Everybody else is gone. I says, well, Aunt Clarine, it's got to be for a reason. Well, a few days prior to the reunion, she passed from this life to the next. God decided it was time, and I just can't help but feel like that has got to be the reason, because everything that happened at that family reunion, not only the stories of their lives and the kind of people that they were, but the fact that they were people of faith came through, I think, loud and clear. And so I just thank God for that experience, the timing of her departure. To me, I think this is God doing things in His way and in His time, and so we feel very fortunate for it.
Mhm.